Now I'm going to answer probably one of my favorite questions, which is how do you make bread and butter pudding cake? Of course, that's not a regular typical question. It's not like how do you roast a chicken or a turkey. Bread and butter pudding cake is a very specific kind of recipe and formula, and it's certainly been one of my favorites. I can tell you now, before you go another minute into this video, that this is one of the neatest, tastiest, crowd-pleasing desserts you're ever going to get your eyes on. And I'm not trying to sell this to you. You make this dessert and you eat it and it will sell itself to you. And it doesn't cost that much. That makes it even better, you know. Most of the time when I'm cooking, I always figure out, well, what's this going to cost to make and blah, blah, blah. So most of us are on some kind of a budget, and that would certainly include me. But from the point of view of the business of cooking, which is what I've done a lot of and still do, I'm always thinking what this costs and how much will this be sold for and so on. So anyway, getting past that story, I want to start by letting you know, too, that I have made thousands, I say the word thousands, of portions of this dessert and have served them. So I already know what's going to happen when you make this and give this to someone, and they're going to say, man, this is really great. Now, of course, everyone has their opinion, like they do about so many really common traditional dishes like bread pudding or stuffing for turkey and things like that. They have their opinions about how these things are made. I hear all the time, that apples and raisins are, so you should be part of this. And yes, you could incorporate whatever you wanted into this. But I think the first time you delve into this recipe, make it the way I show it to you now, in accordance to the video and the written recipe, which you can click on. And try it like that first. So I'm going to give you an overview of this recipe first. First, this is a loaf of square sandwich bread and 10 eggs and 6 cups of milk and some sugar. And a little bit of vanilla. Or you can put whatever flavor you want. You can put a little Grand Marnier or Amaretto, whatever you want, but just go with the vanilla. That's my recommendation. So anyway, this is one of those recipes that appears to be extremely simple, and it is. As long as you know what you're doing, it's very simple. And so I would follow along with this recipe and make it exactly the way I show you, and it'll come out good. If you start doing a bunch of deviations on how you do this, you might find out you got a different recipe going here than the one I'm giving you today. So, bread and butter pudding cake, which is what I call this. Now, most people would just call this bread pudding. Now, I call it bread and butter pudding cake for a number of reasons. First, you can make it in a round pan. You can make it in a rectangle. You can make it in a square. You can make it in a triangle. You can make it in a heart-shaped pan. Any kind of pan you want to make it in, doesn't matter. As long as you follow the ratio of the formula, which is 10 eggs to 6 cups of milk, you will get a certain texture in whatever kind of pan you bake it in. Keep in mind that you need something 1.5 inches deep minimum, and 1 3/4 is probably ideal in terms of the actual level of the custard in the pan when the pudding is baking. Now, I've referred to this recipe as bread flan, because flan is just custard baked in typically in a little custard mold, you know. Well, this is lots of custard mixture baked in a mold with bread. So it's kind of bread flan a little bit. And especially since I recommend a caramel sauce, which I'm going to demonstrate for you. That's a separate video, but it's right here along with this one, next to me probably. The caramel in the flan, which flan has caramel often, usually, at least traditionally it does. So this is flan, bread, caramel. So it's got that flan kind of look and think to it. But it doesn't taste like flan. But there are two very important things about this dessert which you absolutely must understand. The first one is this is about the texture of how this dessert is made. This dessert will have a crispy, toasted top and a soft, spongy interior. This dessert is also not served cold. It doesn't mean it's served hot ideally, you make it in the morning, you let it cool, you let it sit at room temperature, you serve it at room temperature. That's ideal. If you do have to refrigerate it, of course, you can heat it up slightly and, or at least temper it by not having it be cold, because cold changes the texture. Not to, I should say, to make a long story short, but it's already a long story that I'm telling, so I won't say that. But remember, when you refrigerate something like custard and bread, when it gets cold, it condenses and shrinks. That changes the texture. And when you heat it up, it expands it a little bit, and that changes the texture. So we're going to recommend that you eat this dessert at room temperature, made and served on the same day. All right, so this is the pan that we're going to put it in today, and we're going to bake it in a hot water bath. So I have this sitting in a recessed pan here, which ultimately is where it's going to end up. But I'm going to set this aside for a minute. And just want you to get in on the toasting of the bread. First, this recipe calls for approximately 20 to 22 slices of thin sandwich bread. Not extra thin, just regular sandwich style bread that you can buy in a supermarket. And that's what I have in front of me here, one loaf of bread, okay? Now, I toasted these in advance already, and you're going to see me put this underneath the broiler in the oven and bring it out, and it's going to look like that. But I didn't want to spend a lot of time doing that, so I toasted a little bit in advance. But basically, you're going to take your whole unsalted butter that's soft, or what I would call ointment consistency, like toothpaste, if you will, and butter the bread lightly. Put it on a cookie sheet and slide it underneath the broiler and toast it. So I'm going to put this underneath the broiler right here and toast it, and I'm going to time-elapse that, and I'm going to bring you back when I'm taking it out. And then we're going to trim it all, assemble it into the pan, make the custard, pour it in, pop it in the oven. So first, toasting the bread. I got the broiler on high, and I'm going to keep an eye on it because you can burn it. And sometimes you got to take this piece of bread or that piece of bread out of there because it toasted, but a lot of the other ones didn't. So I may be doing a little bit of that before I bring you back in for the final removal of that pan from that oven. I'll be back right now. Okay, the toast, I just checked. It's getting really brown. I'm going to pull it out. And there we go. That's a hot pan. And here, let me switch that around a little bit. Okay, now, here, let's put this aside for a second. I'm not used to working in these domestic kitchens, but they do work. All right, now, I'm going to cool the bread off a little bit by just tilt it up on the sides of the pan. It gives the air a little chance to get underneath it. Okay, now we'll let that cool off. So meanwhile, I got a little bit of cool dip, but we're going to use all of this. First, trimming the bread. Let me see if I got this stuff in the way here. Let me get this out of the way so you can see what I'm doing here. I'll just stick that over there. Now, are you with me? All right. Stack up your bread, and we're going to cut all of the crusts off the bread. Now, you may want to feed them to your dog, feed them to the birds. You could even dry them out, make breadcrumbs out of them in the food processor if you wanted. But that's up to you. Now I'm going to cut the bread into triangles like that. I'm going to end up with a big pile of triangles here. 2, 3, 4, 5. And by the way, one of the things you can do when you're making a bread pudding is you can get this part done the day before. Cover your baking pan with the bread in it with plastic wrap, and do that the night before so that you don't have to do this the day that you make the pudding if you want to schedule your time that way. Okay, let's get some more bread going here. Actually, if you really want to know the truth, my favorite place to cook is in somebody's house or my own house rather than the commercial environments that I have, which work very well if you're making commercial food. But I have this saying that the best meal you're ever going to have is in somebody's house because they got their heart and soul into it, and that's a big part of the whole eating process, you know. So anyway, I don't mind working in these little kitchens. They're fun. But I have this other saying that goes along with that, which is, and I don't want to get you too distracted from the bread pudding here, but it's always a sign of a weak cook that complains about his equipment. And God only knows that good food is made wherever it goes. It doesn't have to come out of a professional kitchen, that's for sure. Or how do you say it? Wherever it goes, there it is. All right. Almost got the bread trimmed. Cutting these all into triangles. Now what you don't want is you don't want the bread drying out so long before you cut it into the triangles like I am that it gets hard. Then when you start cutting the bread, it starts breaking up. You don't want to toast it that much and or dry it that much before you cut it and get it into the pan. The bread becomes inflexible and you need sometimes to shape it into the pan. I'm going to show you an example on how to assemble your bread in a round serving dish or baking dish rather than a rectangle like we're using today. I got a couple more pieces of bread over here if I need them, but we'll see. All right. Okay, let's say I want to show you the difference between this baking pan for making the bread pudding or this, which is really like a big saute pan. You can make your bread pudding in this saute pan if you wanted to, or any kind of cake pan. Just to show you, you don't need a special tool. You could set this on the buffet table for your dessert too, if you wanted to. It wouldn't be my first choice, but I'm trying to make the example for you that this is not about these molds or any of that, and you don't have to get all fussy about that. So let's say you were going to make it in a round one. All you'd have to do is overlap them in here like this, you see. And just keep going around and around and around. You have this really pretty little spiral kind of built into your mold, whichever mold you happen to have, okay? But we're not going to use that mold today, but I wanted to show you that because that's really effective. We're going to use this mold. And in this particular case, instead of there being a round pattern, we'll have a running pattern of rows of bread here. I'll show you what I mean. 1, 2, 3. And you just continue that. 1, 2, 3. That piece will maybe reserve. It's a little toasty on top. 1, 2. This one, somehow I didn't get the crust off of that one. Can't have that. Not to suggest it'll be bad if there's a little crust on it, but you don't want it to be tough on the top of the bread pudding when you're done. You see that little pattern I'm developing here, but I'm staying very systematic about the sequence. It's always 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Wherever you drop off, stop, you got to pick up right at that same spot again, see? That way you have this nice pattern. And when it's all said and done, and this particular dessert is done, you have this really homesy, womsy looking, I hate to say this word, but it's kind of a grandma-ish looking thing, and it really looks nice. And when you make something like this for somebody, they love you more. Now let's say you think you don't have enough bread and you burnt some of your bread and you think it's too toasty. Just do that. That's not going to change anything. Other than giving me more to sweep up later after I'm done making this. Besides that, nothing. Now there are 22 pieces of bread, which was in that loaf, fit into this particular pan perfectly. And in the actual written recipe that you can click on if you want, I believe, if I'm not positive, it is a 10-inch by 2-inch round cake pan that the recipe calls for. Okay?